Hello, everyone. Thank you again for listening to Socially Joe, and welcome to episode 48, where I am joined by my friend Andrew GARCIA, who I met through networking and many different possibilities. But as you all know, I'm the residential realtor. He is my good friend who handles commercial real estate, so I wanted him to join me today so we can learn more about that. So, Andrew, thank you for being on Socially Joe, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate it. Long-time listener, first time on it. My name is Andrew GARCIA with the Smith Garcia Commercial Group at Keller Williams on the Water. I first started, I guess I can say that I first started my commercial real estate career back in New York, probably about 13, 14 years ago, when I worked for a property owner and manager, and I saw the ins and outs of the business from all sides. I got my real estate license about 4 years back while I was in New York and started over there before I met my beautiful wife, and we moved down to sunny Bradenton, Florida. We currently work between Tampa, Port Richey, all the way down through Venice, Englewood, and Northport. We will go anywhere if it makes sense for us commercially. The market is the market, and we hope to fully represent all of our clients.
Nice. I love it, Andrew. So, as I mentioned before, I'm the residential, you're the commercial. So, tell us, what are some of the commercial real estate myths that are out there?
So, one of the most prevalent myths is that you cannot negotiate a lease. A lot of people are used to kind of a residential lease where the lease is the lease, and that's about it. You just sign, you read it. That is not so in commercial real estate. The lease is one of the cruxes of your negotiation. That's after you send in your letter of intent. One of the things that my partner Dennis and I do is that we negotiate on behalf of the tenant if we're representing the tenant in a transaction, or the landlord. It depends on which side of the lease that we're on, that we really try and protect our client to the fullest. There are several gotchas in a lease that we always speak to our clients about, and we make sure that they're well-versed before they even start to think about signing a lease. We go through it fully for them. And these leases can be anywhere between 4 pages to 65 pages or larger. We've pretty much seen it all. The other thing that a lot of tenants, or the other thing about commercial real estate is if you think that, oh, great, I bought a house with Joe, I understand how the real estate market works. It's a different animal from residential. Just like somebody who's bought commercial properties and is trying to go into residential, I would send them to Joe because there are nuances between the two. What works in one doesn't necessarily work in the other. Would you agree with that, Joe?
Oh, I totally agree, because like you said, leases, we don't do leases, we do rentals.
Correct. And the same thing with the buying process. It's, there's always going to be a contract, but again, with residential, and with residential, you do have a lot of hand-holding from the realtor. You don't necessarily need a lawyer. We always tell people that if you want a lawyer, you're more than welcome to. We recommend it. You don't see that as much in residential if you really need a lawyer.
No, we don't see it a lot in residential, but sometimes there are the occasions. So,
of course, yes.
So you kind of touched a little bit about tenants and leases and all this other stuff, but how? Let me ask you this: how long of a lease term should anyone expect if they sign? Like, what's the norm for most people?
Well, that is really up to the landlord. Each space is going to have their own requirements. Each landlord is going to have the own terms that they want to have a tenant in there. Some will be okay with a 12-month lease. I would say a 12-month lease is probably going to be close to the minimum amount of time that you're going to have somebody in there, and that's a very short term for commercial. I would say on average, you should expect to be in a space for at least 3, if not 5 years or longer. There are some larger companies where they won't lease a space unless you can agree to a 5 to 10 year term. It all depends on where the space is, what it's being used for, and where the space is, what it's being used for, and how much work is being done to the space. One of the other things that happens with a commercial lease is that there's something called tenant improvements, where you can take a raw retail space that's basically concrete, maybe a little bit of flooring, and there's some paint on the walls. But what happens to building out for an office or putting in new flooring, new bathrooms? That all gets calculated into whatever the lease rate is, and that's also something that is negotiable. Depending on the longer the lease term, the more you're able to negotiate 9 times out of 10 into how much work you get done, either for free or to get added to your lease rate, so you're not paying for it all at once out of pocket. The other thing that happens in commercial real estate is that, let's say you find a space and you want to completely remodel it. You're not able to negotiate with the landlord. There are commercial banks that will lend you money for what we call build out. So you can build your own space and think of it more like you're mortgaging it off for X amount of years. That's something else that we see happen as well. And it's just a matter of, what do you want to invest in your business? What does your business need to succeed? And what we do is we try to set you up with the right people, or at least give several recommendations so that we can try and equip you for success.
So Andrew, here's the big question. What happens if I break my lease?
If you break your lease, that is an excellent question. If you break your lease, you are still on, to put it plainly, you are still on the hook. If you want to try and break your lease, the best thing that we can suggest to do is to reach out to the landlord first. Let them know what your situation is. Are you in trouble of closing down, declaring bankruptcy? Those are 2 major items. Or is it something where you're not getting enough business and you want to try and downsize? What we cannot stress enough is you can either try and get us involved or go directly to the landlord. At that point, the landlord will probably have a property manager that you've been in contact with 20 times already. But it's key to speak to them first and to let them know what is going on. A lot of the times, open communication will help you be able to walk away from a lease. And there are other situations where the lease is a lease and the landlord will hold you to it. These are legal documents. And what can happen is that this can affect your business credit. This can affect your ability to lease a space in the future, because every landlord will pull a tenant's, not just the credit history, but also the background. And there is a database that shows which tenants have backed away from leases or gotten out of their leases in the past without landlord approval. The other step as well is that if the landlord is not giving you a favorable response, speak to a real estate attorney. They are the ones who draft this language and they speak it. They might be able to find maybe some kind of a loophole or create some kind of settlement with the landlord so that you don't get that black mark on your business's reputation. The third way is to still have a conversation with the landlord and maybe see if you can sublease it out to somebody else. Maybe it might pay for you to try and use a commercial realtor like myself or Dennis and say, would you be able to sublease this space? We really can't afford it anymore. We have the landlord's approval to do so. And there usually is language within the lease that does give you some kind of latitude in terms of finding a new tenant for your space. You're not off the hook. Whoever you do find will still have to make payments for you to not be held liable for any. Sorry, you're still held liable for any rents due.
So that brings up a very valid question. With the emergence of COVID and with the sellers and landlords, has there been more negotiations on the table with pricing and lease rates?
The best answer to that question is depends on the situation. I've had a client who, in the middle of COVID, August, September, their lease was going to be up, and guess what? In order for them to renew, the landlord was doubling the rent because they felt that this was the market rent. It had increased from 3 years ago, and now they were going to try and double the rent. My client left. That space is still sitting empty because we found them a new space at a better rate that fit them. That was a better fit. There are some retail spaces sitting empty now. That is true. There are some landlords who are feeling the pinch. But if you speak to landlord reps, they'll tell you, no, we haven't had any issues. We've still been able to collect most of our rents. Whether that's true or not, ultimately it's up to the landlord to determine if they might be taking their write-offs this year. And they will let some spaces sit empty because they want to get their price. There are others who do feel that pinch and they do want to be more negotiable. So what they'll do is that they might allow you to lease a space at a lower rate, especially initially. There are others that tie rents directly to the gross national product and GDP to see what the increase is there, and they'll follow through accordingly for the next years to come. But ultimately, the best thing that I can say is that when looking at a space, we need to look at it from the specific situation to a space. Are there others looking at that same space that you are? And if so, has anybody written an LOI? Or has it been sitting vacant for 6 months and a leasing agent is telling you we're negotiable, wink, wink, nod, nod, and you can potentially get $1 or $2 off of the asking price per square foot.
So let me ask you this real fast. Just briefly describe what's an LOI.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. An LOI is a letter of intent. A letter of intent usually precedes a lease, and think of it as kind of the boiler. I won't say boilerplate, but it highlights the key areas of the key terms. So it's going to have the date that you take possession of your space. When do you move in? It's going to dictate if you have any free rent, what the price is, what the term is. It even goes down to what the commissions are. It's all built into that LOI. And then once we agree on the LOI, that's when the landlord or the landlord's rep will send over the lease. Once we have the lease, that's when the real fun begins, because then we need to dissect the lease. What we do as tenant reps, and a tenant rep is tenant representation. We represent tenant, we represent landlord. But when we're representing the tenant, what we do is we make sure that our client has enough time to read through the lease fully. We read through the lease fully, and we start to pull out where the red flags are. Does the tenant have to pay for AC if it breaks down? We've had the case where we had a client who, before they started to use our services, they had entered into a lease agreement, a 3-year lease term, and after the first year, one of their ACs broke down, and they were paying $6,000 to get it replaced because that's what their lease said.
Wow.
We try to protect our clients from that. That's a big, big item. Air conditioning, it's one thing to